phenomenon is not new in Black American history, ladies and gentlemen. There was, moreover, a network of civil rights laws that seemed to settle the issue beyond all possibility of dispute or recall. Same kind of situation we talked about here today when you try to tell our people that laws don't protect anyone. There are so many of us who believe that fair housing laws and anti-discrimination laws, civil rights laws, and voting laws, and so forth guarantee our freedom. What an illusion. What a flight into fantasy. Laws are no stronger than their enforcers. And the same people who pass those laws are the same people who are responsible for enforcing the law. And if the people then who enforce the law no longer decide to do so, the laws then are of no value and have no power. Ultimately then, fairness rests, and the fairness of treatment rests, not in laws, but in the activities of people, and in the attitude and consciousness of people. And if people who are responsible for enforcing those laws change their attitudes, then the treatment of those people whose freedom is protected by those so-called laws is now changed as well. You cannot put your faith in a white man's law and in laws enforced by whites. I have warned people many times that if it comes one day where the society has to make a choice between feeding white children and feeding black children, no amounts of civil rights laws or any other laws on the books will prevent those people from feeding their children first. It is a silly faith that we have then in laws. And for people in the 1970s and 80s and 90s to still rest their freedom on the basis of laws, when the very history itself shows us that this cannot be done, we must question their sanity and what they have learned from the study of that history. There was, moreover, a network of civil rights laws, it said, that seemed to settle the issue beyond all possibility of dispute or recall. Back there, 100 years ago, there was a federal law protecting voting rights in the South. Does this all sound vaguely familiar? And there was a national public accommodations law. So the public accommodations law then began with the freedom rides, ladies and gentlemen, in the 1960s. We had those back there in the 1860s and 70s as well. So such, in broad outline, was the racial situation 100 years ago in the 1860s and the 1870s, when racism was forever abolished in America for the first time. It was a short forever. And of course, I'm not going to read the whole piece, but there are just segments in here I want to sort of quote, such as almost every schoolboy knows, the first Reconstruction ended in a major historical catastrophe that wiped out the gains of the 1860s. As a consequence, it required 100 years and oceans of blood for black people to climb back into the political plateau they have occupied in the 1860s and 70s. So, as I stated earlier, history contains both progress and regress. However, I think regress at this point of history will not be a situation where we will be able to fight a battle all over again. I think regress at this point of history essentially spells annihilation for Africans, not only in America, but for Africans the world over. For as I said, he went on to say in Black Power USA, and as Du Bois said before me in Black Reconstruction, Reconstruction in all of its various facets was a supreme lesson for America, the right reading of which might still mark a turning point in our history. So consequently then, as I stated earlier, we must read the history correctly. The mere approaching of history in terms of the celebrating of personalities to a good degree, while important, is also a misreading of history. as well. We must not only celebrate Martin Luther King and the others, we must look at the lessons that history teaches us. He mentions here war on poverty that went on in the 1860s and 70s, the Freedmen's Bureau, and putting on the book civil rights laws, which were in some instances stronger than the civil rights laws passed in the 1960s and 70s. In the wake of these events, there was an explosive growth in black consciousness, and blacks made political gains which surpassed, in many instances, the political gains black made in the 1960s and 70s. A lesson that says what, ladies and gentlemen? That the election of black men and women does not secure the salvation of African people. And that the election of black mayors and governors and your getting jobs for white corporation in no way assures the survival of black people. And we cannot make then the progress of black people synonymous with your qualifying for degrees and your getting jobs downtown. And we must wake up to these possibilities, because we've had this game played on us before. At one time, in fact, black legislators were in the majority in the South Carolina legislature. In the same period as in the comparable period in the 1960s and 70s, poor whites received social and economic benefits rich whites had denied them. Once we got in, we were even good to the poor folks. We set up public school systems and a whole lot of other things. The key element is, and he goes on then to talk about various other things, but I think we should keep in mind here, number of things, if you have a chance, read this particular article, because I think it's very, very important. And this, I'll conclude by reading this. Long discussions about the morals and educational qualifications of blacks obscure the main point: power or the lack of power. I want to repeat this: power or the lack of power. The worst thing that can be said about some leaders of the Reconstruction period is that they did not seem to understand that the only issue was power. We don't talk about that issue very much today either. It seems to frighten many of us. One final point is relevant to an understanding of the power realities of the social movements of both the first and second Reconstructions. In both cases, social and political leaders failed to provide the economic balance that made political balance viable. No one understood this better than the black masses of the 1860s, who said in marches and demonstrations that their freedom was not secure without a firm economic foundation. So I think again then, when we look and celebrate Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and others, we should again look at the essential issues. If, as I will emphasize a bit later on here, your education in this institution is not about gaining real power, not jobs, because your jobs do not represent power. Not getting elected does not represent power either. Buying your houses and fine clothes does not represent power. If it is not about real power, you are being miseducated and misled, and you will die educated and misled. Your study of black history is merely an exercise in feeling good about yourself, then you will die feeling good. The study of history then must be more than the pumping up of your self-esteem and the pumping up of your pride. Those things are important, but ultimately, those things are not the means by which we will save ourselves as people in this world. We must understand the tremendous value of the study of history for the gaining of power. That's why we study history. History has very practical outcomes and very practical meanings. Why is it, do you think, that the other people object to your putting in an African curriculum in New York City schools? Huh? Do you think it's merely because they hate you? Merely because they don't know your history? Merely because they're prejudiced? If you think so, you're sadly mistaken. Because these people know, I think better than we do, that a sound approach to history represents an empowerment of a people, not merely the making them feel good or not. And I read a long piece this summer in the New York Times about the efforts of many blacks to push the African curriculum on college campuses, particularly in California. And of course, one of the white instructors there indicated very clearly that this is about power. They recognize it right away. This is about power, not just